welcome everyone to the Tamil Monks YouTube channel and welcome Comrade Vijay Prashad. So, small and quick introduction about Comrade Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is a director of Tricontinental, which is an organization that covers the labor and various people's movements in the continents of Asia, Africa, and South America. And this organization has been like working closely with all the people's movements and the union movements across these continents from the global across these countries from the global south. So Comrade Vijay Prashad has been very vocal in many burning issues across the globe, and also he never hesitates to call out or criticize capitalists and the mode of production that's going on currently. So Comrade has earlier joined with us once in the past, and we talked about the role of capitalism in the climate crisis. So we want to be more precise with our discussion today, even though it's going to be the same topic, which is the role of capitalism in climate crisis. We want to make this video as a Q&A session, and thanks again, Comrade, for joining with us. We'll jump right into the questions. So the first,
Okay, great to be with you.
yeah, thank you. The first question that I have is, what role can governments play in addressing the climate change? Because I think there needs to be like strong emphasis coming from the government as well, so that it's helpful for everyone to bring awareness to the people about the climate change. So what do you think the role of government should be?
Well, first, I think we should all establish the fact that there is such a thing as the change of climate, the environmental disruption, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, has now delivered verdict upon verdict about rising seawaters, about species degradation, including extinction of a number of species. It's delivered a verdict on the destruction of various coastal communities, coral reefs, and so on. I mean, I think that what the IPCC has produced as a body of work is a pretty comprehensive storyline that something is happening to the climate and the environment, which has to be tackled. And that's the reason why every year there's a kind of urgency around the time of the Conference of Parties, the COP meeting, which is a meeting regarding the treaty on the degradation of the environment and the climate. That period at the lead up to the COP meetings is always a period of some enthusiasm. Environmental activists, climate activists try to put pressure on their governments to go to the COP and be pretty sincere about what they're doing in terms of discussing first the issues, raising funds to mitigate the negative effects of environmental destruction and the climate change, and of course, trying to raise funds to make a transition away from fossil fuels, which is one of the leading causes, at least as far as the science is concerned, of at least climate destruction. Now, environmental destruction is a different matter. There are many causes of that. The most, I think, significant cause is this, unrelenting desire to create profit out of humans' relationship to nature. And so that's, as it were, the way in which people react with their governments. It comes around the time of the Conference of Parties. That's when the real debates and discussions take place. But let's be frank, when we talk about governments, there really is no such thing as an abstract government. There are different kinds of governments. They have different political approaches. There are governments that are utterly given over to the capitalist mode of production. That's the majority of the governments of the world. These governments, for instance, are unwilling to see the role of capitalist, the capitalist mode of production in the destruction of nature and in the perils they've placed the planet regarding the climate. They are not willing to see the role of the capitalist mode of production of capitalist firms. In fact, if you look at the Conference of Parties, many of the panel discussions and much of the funding for a lot of the events that take place come from big corporations, including corporations that make their money in fossil fuels. So most governments are actually unwilling to see that the cause of the climate catastrophe, of environmental destruction, largely baked into the structure of the capitalist mode of production. That's most governments. And for those governments, for instance, they understand the gravity of the problem, maybe, many of them do understand the gravity of the problem, but they've put their eggs into technological solutions, hoping very much that within capitalism, some sort of solution can be found. This is sometimes known as green capitalism. And here the idea is that there'll be new fuels discovered, apart from fossil fuels, that might very well, assist this transition from carbon-based fuel to something else. Well, there are a handful of governments that are committed to either, some form of socialism or committed to some kind of social democratic politics that recognize that the capitalist mode of production is really responsible for the climate crisis. Now, the space of maneuver for these governments is limited. Many of them are only able to talk about regulating the firms, regulating big capital, trying to tax carbon, trying to offset carbon in one way or the other. This is a limited space of maneuver. You have very few instances of a government able to actually come onto the world stage and say, look, we're going to have to transcend the system, go to the next system. Even the Chinese government, which is the government that is doing the most domestically to transition away from fossil fuels, given that it's basically was a very poor country reliant on coal until very recently, now making moves into green energy in a big way. But even the Chinese government, calls upon countries around the world for collaboration. It doesn't go in there and say, let's transcend this mode of production. That's partly because the space of maneuver is limited. Government like that doesn't want to isolate itself. It's putting forward a policy saying, well, let's at least regulate firms. Let's at least raise the funds for mitigation. Let's raise the funds for a kind of just transition. So we are in a period now of pretty catastrophic weakness for the argument that we need a transition away from the capitalist mode of production. This is a time of great weakness, and we need to register that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade. I totally agree with your points. Since you have mentioned political conferences like COP, I just want to bring this question, which is kind of brought upon like frequently. So the question is, third world countries, they are criticized for climate change, but the capitalist Western countries, they pollute them with the industrial waste. So how do we address this, and what needs to be done?
Well, it's a complicated issue because it has two parts to it. The first part is the historical acknowledgement that the principal countries at the core of the world system, that is the North American countries, Europe, and so on, these countries historically for the past 150 years, if not longer, have really had an excess, utilization of the carbon budget. Not only did these countries devastate their own environments, clear cutting trees and so on for capitalist development in their own societies, but they of course also created environmental degradation in their colonies. I mean, India, for instance, there was clear cutting of old mahogany forests, just wiped out in order to build these slats for railroad lines and so on. So, the colonial countries not only devastated their own environment, they devastated the environment around the world, building plantations, growing trees that are actually like weeds, which have a commercial utility. And so that was one part of it is environmental destruction, but the other part of that point, the historical point, is that these countries utilized far and away the majority of the quote-unquote carbon budget. If you say that, look, there's only so much that the environment can absorb, and if you divide it up by, say, population percentages and so on, the West has by far, outstripped the rest of the world in utilizing the carbon budget, and that's a very uneven utilization. That's historical. So one is there needs to be a real acknowledgement of the history of Western environmental destruction and Western utilization of the carbon budget. There has to be that acknowledgement. And alongside that, secondly, the contemporary issue, there has to be a sense that this advantage of having utilized the carbon budget allowed these countries to develop technology, to develop electrification. It's easier for them to talk about a transition than for countries where large sections of the population still don't have electrification, don't have access to the internet, and so on. You can't talk about ending growth in those countries where growth actually just means leaving poverty, whereas in countries of abundance, growth means increasing the abundance. So the second point is very hard to establish because particularly in a time when there is austerity in Western countries, people don't have a political appetite to listen to talk about rollback on consumption. Who should roll back on consumption? What does this mean? Poor people in the West must roll back on consumption because there's an absence of a class, a language, or the language of class. It's complicated to have this conversation in the West. So in the end, neither is the historical conversation taking place in a sober and honest way. That's not happening. But nor is the contemporary issue of the fact that countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America need to have growth in order to have their populations transcend poverty. This is necessary. At the same time, the absence of the language of class in Western countries makes the call for slowing down on consumption very difficult, very unpalatable, because large sections of the people are struggling with austerity. So the upshot of it is the political road forward is very difficult to create, and that's why at events like COP, it's hard to have an honest discussion. And so the easier discussion to have is to imagine that there'll be a technological solution to some of these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Comrade. Since you mentioned technology and also the amount of abundance in the Western countries, I want to touch upon the technology with this question. So how does tech advancement in the capitalist society, I mean, that is the contemporary society, impact the global climate, and what is the solution for minimizing the climate crisis that occurs due to the technology, due to the advancement of technology?
Yeah, so there's, I think, a couple of things again.